Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session where we'll be talking about designing and architecting for upgrades from vSphere and VCF based deployments to VCF 9.0. My name is Sushil Suvarna. I'm a manager within the solution architecture team of VCF, and I'll be co-presenting the session with Kyle. Kyle, you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
So I'm part of the Cloud Foundation technical marketing team. Been working with Cloud Foundation for a number of years. I'll be kind of going over some of the walkthroughs, and we'll let Shishil introduce us to the topic and set some of the design considerations.
Right. So Kyle and I actually did a lengthier version of this session at Explore, and the video is available online with an in-depth demo, etc. But we'll mainly go through some of the things that are probably new since we did that discussion back at Explore. So let me walk through the agenda for today. We'll do a quick overview of some of the VCF 9 concepts for those of you that already might be familiar with VCF versus not. Then we'll go a little bit deeper into the design considerations for VCF 9, and I'll talk about some of the newer things that you would have to think about as you design VCF 9. And then we'll go into specifically the upgrade of vSphere-based deployments and what you need to think through as you upgrade from existing vSphere environments and the different combinations to move on to VCF 9. Kyle will then do an actual walkthrough of an example where he'll talk through the specific steps of upgrading, and then we'll also talk about upgrading existing VCF 5 environments to 9, right? So let's kick it off. Let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to just talk a little bit about is, as part of VCF and VCF 9 specifically, one of the key things that we did was we brought together the best of everything that we had. So irrespective of the kind of infrastructure you have and where that infrastructure is deployed, what VCF does, it offers a unique layer on top of all the infrastructure items that allows you to manage and operate your existing infrastructure, right? So if you're an enterprise IT admin, you're really looking at mechanisms through which you can maintain consistency in terms of identity and access management, capacity management, tenancy, etc. But at the same time, you want to ensure that your infrastructure is healthy. So you want to make sure that you're monitoring and troubleshooting any of the issues that come up. Now, as you get to the next layer, from the line of business admin, you're looking at a different level of managing. This is more around role-based access or creating policies, and also building the right set of tools to automate and orchestrate everything that's under the covers. And finally, when we look at the end user, what the end user really requires is an actual consumption interface that's easy for them to create and build their workloads, whether it is native workloads or modern workloads, so that the infrastructure under the covers is completely transparent to them. So that's how we separate out the entire stack that we have in VCF as the core infrastructure under the covers, but then the layers of building and operating the private cloud and consuming the private cloud. So as part of all of the integrations that we built, what we did was we took the existing VCF operations and enhanced that even further to become the kind of manage and operate layer of VCF. And then we took what we had in terms of the existing vRealize automation or ARIA automation component and converted that into a much more modern consumption interface in VCF automation. I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of these components as well. So the first thing to remember is a lot of users currently actively use vRealize operations, or what is known as ARIA operations, and now VCF operations. However, in the past, what this would do is it would basically be the central part of monitoring and troubleshooting, and it would also have things like capacity planning and chargeback. A lot of the operations within VCF operations used to just be read-only. Now, with VCF 9, that has evolved into becoming kind of the central console for the private cloud that we are building with VCF 9. So in addition to everything that it did earlier, now it also does lifecycle management. It does licensing, because there's a key change in terms of licensing from key-based licensing to keyless licensing in 9.0. And it also does all of the fleet management. So now it will do your single sign-on, certificate management, password management, tag management. So VCF operations now becomes that central console that not only does the operating capabilities that it did earlier, but also expands into a whole lot of managed capabilities moving forward. The second evolution is for VCF automation. So VCF automation brings together and blends a set of capabilities that we had with VRA in the past, as well as vCloud Director. And it's a whole new interface that offers three key capabilities. The first is a brand new self-service catalog that offers a whole lot of out-of-the-box services that serves as your overall application catalog for building your workloads. The next is a whole new modern cloud experience that serves as a consistent consumption platform to build your workloads based on VMs or containers. Everything is in one place with a whole lot of support for the existing application blueprints as well as workflow orchestration. And finally, you have true multi-tenancy that's built into VCF automation that allows you to segregate all of your resources so that you can carve out a whole lot of infrastructure according to the requirements of your tenants or your lines of business. So let's take a quick look at what some of the VCF constructs are. Some of you that have already worked with VCF 5 might be familiar with some of these concepts, but there's also a few new concepts. So we have a notion of a domain, an instance, a fleet, and a private cloud. And we kind of go through each of these, right? So for all of those that are kind of familiar right now with what VCF instance is, because of the way it used to work in VCF 5 or earlier, a lot of that kind of remains the same. A VCF instance brings together a combination of vSphere, vSAN, NSX, and puts it all together. You have the flexibility of also using your own storage if you need to, but that's what builds an actual VCF instance is a combination of each of these compute, storage, and networking components. What happens beyond that is we now have a notion of a VCF fleet. And this is something new that we introduced in VCF 9, where you can have a lot of different infrastructure components that are carved across in multiple instances, but you can have a single operations and a single automation that serves as your operate and manage layer and your consumption layer for your entire infrastructure. And you get the flexibility in terms of how you want to design it, but a single automation and a single VCF operations component together with a bunch of different instances form a VCF fleet. And then as you look at this from a logical construct, this is kind of what it looks like, where you have different instances under the covers that are managed by a single VCF operations and has a single VCF automation that can serve as the consumption layer. The key thing to remember, and also Kyle will go into this in detail, is that if you have existing components, if you have existing ARIA operations or ARIA automation, you can just take that and move it into the new world and convert it into your VCF operations and VCF automation for your new fleet. The whole intent from our perspective in terms of upgrades was to make it as easy as possible for you. So you get a chance to reuse any of the components that you already have, and you don't necessarily need to deploy a whole lot of new components. So we give you that flexibility in terms of how you want to design and architect your environment moving forward. So if you do have multiple VCF fleets, and this can happen if you, there are certain scale and latency requirements for what a single VCF automation and a single VCF operation can actually handle. Or if you just have an organizational preference to be able to carve out your infrastructure into different silos, you can still do that. But multiple different VCF fleets come together and form a VCF private cloud. So this is kind of how all of this comes together in our new vision for VCF. So let me just quickly go through some of the design considerations that we've thought through as you look at VCF 9. And I'll go through each of them. But the first thing I wanted to mention is that you have different paths to actually get to VCF 9. The first is you can create a brand new deployment, of course, that's option one. Option two is you can upgrade from an existing vSphere-based deployment with any combination of vSphere and the other components that exist. And option three is you can upgrade from an existing VCF deployment. So if we just focus on what are some of the design constructs that you need to think through as you start building out your VCF 9 environment, We have four different designs that we have put together that gives you a guideline for how you should start thinking about the new world. The first is a basic design where you have you can carve out your entire infrastructure, and you can have a basic VCF design that has a set of instances and fleets where you don't necessarily need a whole lot of resiliency or availability across availability zones or across different regions. The next evolution of the design, which has a little more resiliency in it, offers high availability across zones. So this would create an active-active configuration where you would set up your management domain in a way through which a fault of one AZ, for example, will not affect the other, and you have an active deployment in place at all the time. The third evolution of the designs in terms of resiliency is disaster recovery, where you can protect your entire infrastructure in case of actual disasters. If an entire site goes down, how do you recover it in case of an actual disaster? And there's another one where we blend in the best of all of the different worlds. So I had a presentation that we did at Explore. It was done with William Lamb. It's available as part of all of the Explore resources. If you want to know more about all of these designs, you can go and take a look at it. There's a lot more detail about all of these in there. All right, so I'm just going to quickly go through what the transition looks like to upgrade from vSphere to VCF 9. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to visually show you what that evolution looks like based on the infrastructure or topology that you already have. So we're going to talk about option 2 here, where you're upgrading from vSphere, going into VCF 9. So let's take a look at this sample scenario where you have one or many deployments of vSphere, where each vCenter is actually managing all of the workloads that are riding on that same cluster. So this is what we would consider as a consolidated sort of architecture in the past. What we'll do is we'll look at how this evolves into VCF 9, because like I said, we want to try to reuse as much as you can. So the first step of moving is you obviously allocate whatever additional resources are required to move to VCF 9. And then the first thing that you'll do is you'll pick a vCenter that can serve as your vCenter for the management domain. And as soon as you do that, when you do the converge operation of moving this to a management domain in VCF 9, NSX gets deployed. You have the flexibility of using it if you want to, but because we're talking about private cloud, we deploy NSX behind the scenes. The next thing that will happen is that VCF operations and VCF automation come in to start building out the actual management domain. So the very first management domain that you create will have these two components inside it. Once you do that, you can take your other vCenters and start bringing them in as workload domains. And NSX comes in along with each of those. Once you tie them all together, that now becomes your VCF fleet. So this is kind of the first example of how you take existing topology and components and move it to VCF 9. I'm going to show the exact same example through a slightly different topology where you have one management vCenter that's managing all of the other vCenters, but the workloads are on different hardware. So this is what you would consider as a standard architecture in terms of what we speak about in the older VCF days. But here you have to pick the first vCenter that you actually want to upgrade and move to VCF 9. And you go through the same process where you start building out your management domain first. You go ahead and deploy operations and automation. If you already have them, you can reuse them. And then you start slowly bringing in your workloads as workload domains. The one thing I wanted to mention, and as Kyle goes through the actual steps, right? Not everything has to be done at once. We leave the flexibility over to you in terms of how you want to get from where you are to where you need to go. We understand upgrades can take time. So at the end of the day, if you want to create a management domain first, then take your time to create and build out the workload domains. That's also perfectly fine. You have that entire flexibility of doing that as you go through the journey. So having said that, this is how you start building out the fleet and the private cloud. And we have created specific curated upgrade guides based on the most common combinations of components that we see out there. And that's that's part of the documentation. Feel free to refer to them to get an idea of how to move from different combinations of existing components into VCF 9. And having said that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to go through the walkthrough to upgrade from VCF, from vSphere to VCF 9. Over to you, Kyle.
All right, thank you, Sushil. Let me get my screen sharing going. So yeah, so I'm gonna basically walk us through some scenarios, showing what the process is. Go first from the vSphere side, and then we'll look at it from the VCF side. So at a high level, when you're starting your upgrade path is going to be determined based on three core questions. So the first question is really, are you going to be coming from a vSphere environment? And this could be a VVF environment or a vSphere 8 environment. So from a vSphere standpoint, we kind of treat them the same. But are you coming from that environment or are you coming from an existing VCF environment? So again, a VCF environment would be a VCF where you have an SDDC manager, you have the SDDC manager LCM, or you're coming from a vSphere environment that does not have that SDDC manager. So that's one of the first questions. And then let's say you're doing a vSphere upgrade from a vSphere environment. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, are you currently running the ARIA operations? So yes, we've renamed the ARIA components to VCF, but I'm going to go ahead and use the old names in this conversation just to kind of help make it clear when we're talking about a pre-upgrade state versus a post-upgrade state. So the first thing is, you're running a vSphere environment. Are you using ARIA operations in that environment? And the reason why this is important is because this will change the order in which you perform the upgrade. Now, as we go through this, you're going to notice that the steps are largely the same. It's just the ordering that we're going to be talking about in terms of how we complete each task. So from a standpoint of ARIA operations, if you don't have ARIA operations, then that's probably the simplest path, because then you just go in and you use what we call the VCF installer. And you're going to go in and you will need to upgrade the environment from vSphere 8.x to vSphere 9.x. And then once you've completed that vSphere upgrade, you'll deploy the installer, you download the VCF 9 binaries, and you'll use the installer to deploy VCF. And I'm going to go through a little bit more detail in this in the slides that come up. So I'm going to just kind of skip through this. The next question is, okay, if you're using ARIA operations, is that ARIA operations being managed by an ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager or the ARIA LCM appliance? And if not, then you will need to account for the ARIA operations, and you'll start by upgrading it. So you'll notice it's the same upgrade path, but the difference here is you're going to first upgrade the operations to 9.0. So again, I'm a vSphere shop, not running ARIA operations. I just go ahead and do the upgrade from the installer. If I am running ARIA operations, then I need to determine if I'm using the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager. If not, I'm going to manually upgrade ops, and then I'm going to go through and proceed to do my upgrade. If I am using the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, then I have a bit of a benefit, because I can now use this ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager in order to orchestrate or coordinate the upgrade of ARIA operations. So if I have this, then I can basically go in, and the first thing I'll need to do is update the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager to 8.18 patch 2. And what that patch 2 is going to do is bring in the VCF 9 awareness. Now I can use the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, the updated version, to then upgrade ops. And as part of this upgrade, it will also deploy the new Fleet Manager appliance. And then I can go ahead and proceed to do my upgrade. Okay. Now you'll notice in this example, we're looking at a vSphere environment. This slide was built for 9.0. And in 9.0, we did not support converging vSphere environment that was registered with VMware NSX. So if you're running NSX, there was not a path for you at that time. But we released a patch recently, I think the end of September, the 9.0.1 patch, and that patch added support. So now there would be, I need to update this slide because there's now a fourth option. Are you running vSphere with NSX? If you're running vSphere with NSX, the same basic process entails, but there's one key difference here. And you'll notice when I call out a vSphere upgrade, I'm not saying which version, because if you're not using NSX, you will need to upgrade to vSphere 9. And when we talk about a vSphere upgrade, we're talking about vCenter and ESX. Both those will be needed to be updated to 9 prior to doing the converging. Now, don't confuse converging with importing. I'll bring that up again a little bit later, but we're talking about building a VCF management domain off of existing infrastructure. That's what the converging is referencing. So for this, if you're not using NSX, you will need to upgrade both vSphere and ESX to 9.0, and that is for both VCF 9 and 9.0.1. If you are using NSX, then you will need to upgrade vSphere to 8.0 Update 3 and NSX to 4.2.1.0. And this is this is when you're going to be using the VCF 9.0.1 installer. So a little bit of a nuance there in terms of the versioning, but the path and the process is the same. And I'll go into this a little bit more detail coming up. So now the other side, if we have VCF, it's a similar process. Again, you're going to start by saying, okay, I got VCF. Have I deployed my ARIA operations into my VCF environment? If not, then I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to upgrade my SDDC manager. I'm going to use my SDDC manager to upgrade NSX, upgrade vCenter, upgrade ESX. And then I will, after I've done the upgrade of my management domain, I will go in and manually deploy operations, the fleet management. I will do some configuration, and then I will deploy the collector. And so, so if I don't have ARIA operations, I'm basically just going to use the SDDC manager, do the upgrade, then I'm going to deploy the ARIA components. If I do have ARIA operations, then again, I have to ask if I'm using the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager. If not, I will go in and I will do the manual upgrade of ARIA operations, and then I will deploy the Fleet Manager, then use the SDDC manager to do the upgrade, come back, do some additional configuration. And then if I am using the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, then here again, I can basically patch that and use that to do the upgrade of ops and deploy Fleet Manager, and then use the SDDC manager to do the upgrade. So that's kind of a high-level overview. We're going to go through this a little bit more detail. The one thing I want to point out here before I move on to the next slide is you'll notice that each one of these ends with license, 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 license. So that is very important, because when you go from a vSphere 8.x to VCF 9, you will be moving away from the older license keys to the new license file. And so as part of the upgrade in all these scenarios, the environment will revert to evaluation licenses, so a 90-day evaluation license, and you will need to log into operations and relicense the environment. That will be the final step in all these scenarios. So with that, let's go ahead and look at this in a little bit more detail. So we're going to go through 3 different scenarios for the vSphere. So again, those scenarios kind of tie in with what we just looked at. I have a vSphere environment with ops without the RELCM, a vSphere environment with RELCM and with ops. And let's just kind of look at a high level of what this process is going to entail. You look here on this slide, I basically have numbered the steps. These are I tried to follow the documentation as close as I could, but this is kind of the preferred or recommended upgrade approach. What you see here on the left under vSphere, these are going to be manual steps that you're going to need to perform. You can call these prerequisites perhaps. And then you see here in the middle, we have the VCF installer. This is the new component that's going to basically guide you through the upgrade. And it's going to provide, in a lot of ways, a fully automated upgrade process. It's really going to make it easy for you. And then after you've upgraded, you'll see that relicense is the screen, and then we can move on to any post-upgrade activities. So you'll see here, a couple of things to call out here is, as part of the upgrade, in all cases, you will need to make sure you're using VLCM images. So if you're still using VUM, or the old, what we used to refer to as VUM or VLCM baselines, you will need to make that transition prior to doing your upgrade. And again, you will need to upgrade to, if you're not using NSX, you'll need to upgrade to vSphere version 9, and that includes both the vCenter ESX. You'll then download the installer, which is an OVA that's available. And then once you download that, you'll need to go in and set up what we call a depot, where you'll download the binaries. Okay, and that's kind of the prerequisites. And then once you're done, you basically go into the VCF installer. And the VCF installer will basically provide a nice UI that will walk you through the process of taking that existing vSphere environment, bringing it in, creating your management domain. It will deploy NSX. It will then configure the SDDC manager. It will deploy the fleet management, deploy the collector, and deploy automation, VCF automation. Then when you're done, the upgrade is technically done. You'll be running in evaluation mode. So you'll go into operations, you'll get your license file, relicense the environment, and move on to your day 2 activities. So that's kind of the high-level overview. And again, this is probably one of the more simpler use cases, because you're going to use that VCF installer to deploy these new components to include VCF operations, the VCF fleet manager, VCF automation, the VCF operations collector. Okay. Now let's go on to the second scenario, and you'll see the second scenario looks very similar to the first scenario. But here again, we have this step up here in the beginning, where we're going to need to upgrade, say, from ARIA operations 8.18 up to VCF operations 9.0. So we start by performing that upgrade. So basically go into operations, we'll download the upgrade package, we will then perform the upgrade, and we'll get operations running 9.0. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us a 9.0 instance of operations. And we're going to need that because we're going to have to relicense this after we get done with the upgrade. So we start with operations in order to make sure we can do that. Then we'll go in, and again, we'll take care of that transition to VLCM images if it's not already done. We will upgrade our environment, deploy the installer to binaries, and then do the installer. Now here, because we have an existing instance of operations, you'll see that in addition to converging the vSphere environment, it also converges that existing operations. So basically, the installer is going to say, hey, what is the login to vCenter? What's the login to ops? It's basically going to take those two environments, and it's basically going to import those, create a management domain, and then just add the remaining components. Okay. And so that's that scenario. Now, the third scenario, this is where we have this ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager. And again, the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager is a kind of a management component for the ARIA Suite. And if we have that, it gives us an added benefit because it reduces the number of manual steps, tasks we need to do as part of the prerequisites. Because here, what we can do is we can then go in, and we do have to apply that patch. And that patch for the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager is going to basically make the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager VCF 9 aware. It basically tells the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, hey, there's this version called VCF 9. You can download the binaries. You can use those binaries to upgrade the different components. So we apply that update. And then with that update, we can now go in and use the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager and the automation capabilities it provides to then automate the upgrade of operations. And as part of that, it will also deploy the new fleet management appliance. The new fleet management appliance is basically just the new version of the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, but you will have both the old version of the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager and the new fleet manager running in parallel. And you will continue to use the old version of the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager to manage components that have not been upgraded to 9.0. So, for example, VIDM or older versions of the ARIA Suite that would still be in your environment, you would still have that. So you can run these in parallel. Okay, but once you do that upgrade, you upgrade those components, then you see it goes right back to that familiar flow that we've seen the previous two times, where we basically are going to handle our transition to VLCM images. We're going to upgrade vSphere environment. This one I have, I have an extra step here in the slide you may have missed before, but just to keep in mind that when we do upgrade vSphere, as part of that vSphere environment, there's the vSphere upgrade, which is our vCenter upgrade, our ESX upgrade, but there's also a version associated with our VDS, our vSphere distributed switch. There's a version associated there. There's also a version associated with our vSAN disk groups. So as part of this upgrade, it's always good to go and upgrade those. And I'd also note that, VMware tools, virtual hardware, those are other things that you may want to consider as part of your upgrade planning. But I just called that out here as kind of a reminder. But the bread and butter here is the VCF installer and using the installer. And you deploy the installer, you download the binaries, and then you use the installer to do the upgrade. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, I've seen a few questions in the chat, so I just want to kind of reiterate this. So whether we're calling this a vSphere environment or whether it's a VVF environment, it really is kind of the same process, because a VVF environment would essentially be the equivalent of this second row here. You basically have vSphere with operations. And so you would just basically go in and take your VVF environment, which would already be running 9, and you just basically install the installer, use the installer. It will install the additional components to basically converge that environment into a VCF environment, which would then add the NSX as well as the automation. Okay, so that's kind of the high level overview for the vSphere. So we went through 3 different scenarios. Sushil and I did do a session on this at Explore, and at Explore, we actually walked through and did a demo of this, but due to time constraints we have today, being this is a 45-minute session, we're not really able to go in and do the demo. So we will just go ahead and do the walkthrough, and I will point you to some resources at the end that are on YouTube, and you can also go out and search for that Explore session if you want to see that demo as well. Okay. Now, I kind of touched on this, but I just want to reiterate this because this is important. We get a lot of questions about, hey, what about NSX? So I have in your example, you talk about having vSphere, you talk about having operations, you talk about having the lifecycle manager for the ARIA suite. But what about environments with NSX? So when we first released 9.0, we had a period of time where we didn't really have a path to upgrade if you had NSX, because we didn't really have a way to upgrade NSX to 9.0. So this became available the end of September with the 9.0.1 patch. So yes, this is a a patch, but in this patch we have this significant change, because now what we can do is we can take a vSphere environment that has a NSX registered together with the ARIA components. You may or may not have those, but you can basically take this environment and you can now do the upgrade. And again, as I kind of mentioned before, and just to reiterate that the key difference here is when you have NSX, it affects the version that you're going to upgrade to. So when you have NSX with VCF 9.0.1, when you have NSX, instead of upgrading vSphere to 9.0, you'll upgrade it to 8.0 update 3. And then the NSX, you'll need to make sure it's running 4.2.1.0. So you'll basically go in, follow the same process, but when you do that upgrade of vSphere, you'll only go up to 8.0 update 3. You'll then go in, upgrade your NSX to 4.2.1.0. Then that gives you the version of vSphere and the version of NSX that we then need for the installer to go in and converge both the vCenter and the operations, as well as converge the NSX. And basically, once you are done, you will basically have a VCF management domain that will be running on the VCF 5.2 bill of materials. So it'll be running 8.0 update 3 with NSX 4.2. And then you can go in and use the lifecycle management capabilities inside of the operations to then upgrade all the components to 9.0. So just a little bit of a nuance there with regards to the versioning, but the process is largely the same. It just depends on where you upgrade as part of the prerequisites before you turn over to the installer. And just keep in mind that regardless, if you do not have NSX, you will always need to go up to version 9.0, and then the installer will then converge your management domain. If you have NSX in the current 9.0.1, you'll go to update 3 with NSX 4.2.1.0. So hopefully that will help give you a good understanding of the NSX upgrade path. Okay, so with that, I'm now going to shift gears and get into VCF. If you remember that slide before, it's a similar line of questioning in terms of, hey, you got VCF. So with this, it means I have something called the SDDC manager, and I may or may not have the ARIA components. I may or may not have ARIA automation. I may or may not have an existing ARIA LCM. And so again, we'll look at those upgrade scenarios from this perspective. So we talked about option 2 in pretty good detail. Now we're moving on to option 3. And so we're going to look at it from the similar perspective of here. We have our 5.2 environment. You can upgrade from VCF 5. I believe 5.0 and above. You'll want to check the release notes on that. I'm using 5.2 in my example because this is what I tested in my lab. But here again, we start with the simple scenario where I just have VCF 5.2, but I have not deployed any of the ARIA components. So you'll notice here, I don't have VCF installer listed here. That's because I already have VCF. So I'm not going to use the VCF installer. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the SDDC manager. So I'm going to go into that SDDC manager. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to download an update for the SDDC manager, and I'm going to upgrade it to version 9.0. Once I've upgraded my SDDC manager to version 9.0, it will then make the binaries available for the 9.0 version of NSX, vCenter, and ESX. So I'll download those binaries. And then once I have those downloaded binaries, I basically use the SDDC manager to do the upgrade. Now here again, I do have a note because you will need to make that VUM to VLCM transition before you do the upgrade. I just was losing real estate here on the slide, so I just kind of moved that box out in order to make some room for other things. But just keep in mind that you will need to make that transition to VLCM images in both, regardless of whether you're a vSphere upgrade or a VCF upgrade, you'll need to make that change. Okay. Then once I've completed this upgrade, my management domain will now be running VCF 9.0. Okay, so now I'm going to shift away from the SDDC manager, and now I got some manual operations because now what I need to do is go back into vSphere. And here again, because we upgraded our vSphere version, we want to upgrade our associated vSphere distributed switch version as well as our vSAN version. Once we've done that, we will then go in and notice here we're going to manually deploy operations and manually deploy the fleet manager. So we'll download those OVAs, we'll deploy those into the environment. And then once we've got operations up and running, we will then switch over to VCF operations where we will do some additional configuration to register the two together. We will set up some deployment targets. This is basically setting up the fleet manager. And then we will go in and download additional binaries inside of the operations fleet manager. These binaries, over here, we're downloading NSX, vCenter, ESX. Here, we're downloading the operations, the logs for networks, the automation. And then we will, there's a step here, this is in the documentation, that we will need to update our operations certificate. That's because when we manually deploy operations, it doesn't have the private key that's required to automate the deployment of components. So once we deploy it, get it set up, we go here, we just use VCF operations to go and update that TLS certificate. Once it's updated, we can then go in and deploy our ops collector and deploy automation. And then you see here, we go and relicense, and then our end state here is the same. So now we're at the same place we were in all the other examples. We have our 9.0 management domain with all the required components. And then we can move on to those day two operations. So if you look at this kind of flow here and the sequencing, you'll see there's some, you're going to use the SDC manager to basically do that upgrade. And there's some manual steps. And these manual steps are going to vary as we go through the next few slides. So here, if we go to the next example, here we have RA operations. So you'll notice we moved some of the manual steps up front. So now, because we already have an existing version of operations, we're going to start by upgrading that. And then we're going to deploy the fleet manager. And then we're going to take care of some of that initial configuration. So since we have operations, we're going to start by deploying, upgrading it, deploying the fleet manager and doing some of that configuration. Then we switch over to the SDC manager where we do the upgrade of our management domain. And then we'll switch back to vSphere, upgrade that VDS and vSAN version. And then we come back to VCF operations where we'll then do the additional configuration and download the additional binaries and deploy the collector and automation. And then we'll go ahead and relicense. And then moving on to the last example here, you'll see similar in this, as we've seen before, here we're going to take advantage of the fact that we have the RA Suite Lifecycle Manager, because we're going to be able to use that to automate the upgrade. So instead of having to upgrade ops manually and manually deploy the fleet manager, we're now able to use the RA Suite Lifecycle Manager to automate those two steps. And with that automation, it takes care of some of that configuration. So we actually save some step here. Then we use the SDC Manager to upgrade, and then the process looks the same. Now, a couple comments here on the VCF upgrade path. You'll notice the NSX is always part of VCF. So the NSX upgrade is taken care of by the SDC manager. So where we had that NSX consideration in the vSphere side, we don't have that same consideration on the VCF side because NSX is already a component inside of Cloud Foundation. All right. So I went through this very quickly in the time we have. I just wanted to point you to a playlist we do have. So if you go out to YouTube, there's a VCF Cloud Foundation Upgrade Paths playlist where it has basically an overview of what we've just gone through. And you can spend more time going through this. They're just short little videos of me walking through what we've just went through here together. And then some of these will have some additional information as well. So just you'll get these slides, you can screenshot this, but just be aware we do have this. And we are continually working to update and to add more content as well. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just going to wrap up with a quick overview of some of our key takeaways here. So as Sushil mentioned, you'll wanna start your upgrade by first making sure you understand this concept of a VCF fleet and a VCF instance. So these are new terms we've introduced with VCF 9. And there's a lot of flexibility here. You know, if I have, am I gonna have my VCF, my private cloud running at a single location? Is it gonna span across locations? If I span across locations, am I gonna have a single instance of operations and automation to manage that? Or, you know, in other words, am I gonna have a single fleet? Or am I going to want to have separate fleets and set up some type of BCDR solution between those with a failover capability? And then within a fleet, when you get into a site and you start looking at it, how many VCF instances are you going to want to have? Are you going to have multiple instances, separate instances for various reasons, or are you going to want to have the same? So those are some of the design considerations. You know, Sushil went through a number of details around that. But that's kind of the step one. If you haven't thought through what your end state is, or what your desired end state is, you'll want to do that before you start the upgrade, because that's going to influence perhaps, if I have existing environments, which one am I going to converge into my management domain? Is that going to be at site A or site B? Or am I going to converge two management domains, have one at site A, one at site B? And then that will influence, what I'm going to upgrade and what order I upgrade. Is the hardware in those environments going to meet the requirements? So again, it all starts by understanding this concept of a VCF fleet and a VCF instance, understanding the relationship that a VCF fleet is comprised of one or more VCF instances. And then once you've got that design down, look at your environment, look at your topology, come up with your desired end state, and then you can start planning out your upgrade. Along that note, you'll want to make sure you prepare for your upgrades. One thing I like to really stress is that if you have garbage in, garbage out. So if I have a vSphere environment and I log in, I see a lot of alerts, alarms, I have a lot of unused capacity, idle capacity. If I have some configuration issues, we have a lot of guardrails. We do a lot of pre-checks. We do our best to help make sure that you'll have a successful upgrade. But just keep in mind that anything that's kind of in that environment that's a little suspect, or something that maybe you're thinking, I don't really know if I want to bring this forward, you want to take care of that before you do the upgrade, because when you do the upgrade, it's just going to bring all that stuff forward. So don't ignore any alarms or alerts. If you go into vSphere and you have these nagging alerts that have been kind of pestering you for a while, dig into them, figure out what's going on, open up a support case, get to the bottom of those, because you never know if they're going to present a problem when you do the upgrade. And also, after you do the upgrade, if they don't present a problem, they're still going to exist after the upgrade, most likely. So think about that. We do have a lot of documentation out there in the form of checklist. We identify prerequisites, we identify requirements. We have pre-checks, especially if you're on the VCF side. If you're running VCF 5.x, you can go out and do a pre-check of your environment. You can identify, but spend some time, make sure your environment is ready for the upgrade. If you have multiple clusters, make sure you pick the one that's best suited for hosting additional components. We didn't really get into it, but when you look at taking a vSphere environment and upgrading it to VCF 9.0, do you have the capacity? If I have one cluster, it's going to basically make that cluster the default cluster, and that's where it's going to deploy those additional components, the operations collector, the automation, the NSX, if you're not already using those. But what if I have multiple clusters? Well, it's going to make one of those the default cluster, and it's going to make that decision based on where the vCenter server is running. So you might want to have to do some VM migrations and move some vCenters around in order to help make sure you get the right default cluster. So again, think about that, prepare for that upgrade. And then the last thing is here, the key takeaway is that regardless of your starting state, we've done a lot of work to make sure we can meet you where you are. So if you're a vSphere only customer and you're not using any of the ARIA components, we got you covered. The VCF installer will get you upgraded to your VCF 9 in a very non-disruptive way. We do make some changes to the inventory. So when you log into vCenter, you'll see some changes. We'll create some resource pools. We might move some things in folders. We will deploy additional components. So I won't say it's not at all intrusive. We are making some changes, but these changes are very minor, and they should not affect any of your running workload. So it should be a largely non-disruptive upgrade path. And that's, and if you are running, say, ARIA components, whether you're running standalone ARIA operations or ARIA operations with the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, again, we take those into account. And now with the 9.0.1 patch, we can also take into account existing instances of NSX. So regardless if you're running those kind of as part of a vSphere environment, or if you're running them as part of a VCF environment, as you've seen as we've gone through these slides, we've really done a lot of work to help make sure that regardless of where you're at, where you're starting, we have a path for you to get to VCF 9 and going forward. So help you get to that private cloud experience as quickly and non-disruptively as possible. And so with that, we're getting towards the end of our time together. So I want to thank everybody for taking your time. Let me do a quick time check. So it looks like, we're just right about on time. So hopefully you got your questions answered. Thank you very much. And we can go ahead and wrap up this session, give you guys a break so you can get moved on to your next session.